Flight attendant asks black billionaire to switch VIP seats to white passengers after one call. Witness an unsettling incident that challenges perceptions of privilege and prejudice aboard a luxury flight. A black billionaire passenger, comfortably settled in his VIP seat, is unexpectedly approached by a flight attendant with an unusual request that raises eyebrows and questions of fairness. Tell us whether you find great excitement in this narrative. Press 1 if the video delighted you. Press 0 otherwise not. Your comments really motivate me to compile more inspiring and significant narratives.
Eliza sat in her seat. The hum of the airplane now a soothing, familiar sound as it lifted into the sky. This was supposed to be her moment of respite, a hard-earned break after years of late nights and corporate battles. The flight was just a few hours. But it was more than a flight, it was a statement. A silent declaration to herself that she had made it. For years, Eliza had climbed the ranks in her field, each step marked by a quiet sacrifice and a refusal to let the world define her. She had been told, time and time again, that she wasn't quite enough, too loud, too proud, too assertive in a world that wanted her quiet. But today, as she settled into the VIP seat she'd worked so hard to secure, she felt something close to triumph. It wasn't just luxury, it was a small victory in a life filled with compromise. But as the plane rose higher, her comfort was shattered by the arrival of a flight attendant. The woman, younger than Eliza by a decade, wore a smile that seemed practiced, almost apologetic, as she approached her seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice carrying a soft edge that seemed to coat the request with false politeness. "We need you to switch seats." At first, Eliza thought it was a mistake, a simple logistical issue. After all, she had paid for this seat, her ticket in hand. A perfect match with the seat assignment. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat," Eliza said, the calm firmness of her voice carrying her certainty. She glanced down at her ticket once more, ensuring she wasn't mistaken. The attendant hesitated, her eyes darting to the man standing a few feet away, the one Eliza had barely noticed. He was tall, dressed sharply in a business suit, his face set with the kind of cold entitlement Eliza had come to recognize all too well. He wasn't elderly, nor did he appear to have any legitimate need for the upgrade. But there was something about his posture, something unspoken, that screamed privilege. For a fleeting moment, Eliza's mind tried to reason with the situation. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps the man truly needed the seat, had a medical condition, or some urgent issue that made his claim legitimate. But as she looked at him more closely, Eliza realized the truth. This wasn't about necessity. It wasn't about health or an emergency. This was about something much uglier. Something she'd seen too many times before, an unspoken assumption that her place was never quite as secure as his. The flight attendant's smile faltered. It was as if she had been trained for this moment, prepared to handle someone like Eliza. She repeated the request, a little more impatiently this time. "We really need you to move. Please." Eliza remained seated, her pulse quickening. The heat of the situation was slowly beginning to creep in, but she kept her voice steady. "I paid for this seat," she said. "I'm not moving." The attendant's face hardened. Her patience was clearly wearing thin. But there was something else behind her words now. Something that Eliza could hear beneath the surface: resentment, frustration, a quiet demand that she comply. But Eliza refused. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about something deeper. For years, she had been asked, directly or indirectly, to step aside. She had been made to feel like she didn't belong in spaces that she had earned the right to occupy. This moment, though it seemed trivial, was a culmination of all those years of quiet marginalization. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about a lifetime of having to justify her place in the world. The attendant's voice grew sharper. "It's just a seat. Ma'am, please, cooperate." Eliza's gaze remained steady, and she met the attendant's eyes directly. "It's not just a seat," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "It's the seat I paid for." The air between them thickened. The tension in the cabin was palpable now. As passengers began to stir, glancing over to see what was happening, some stared curiously. Others, particularly the white passengers nearby, seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. There was an unspoken sense of irritation in the air, irritation not at the airline or at the situation, but at Eliza herself. She could feel it, the subtle undercurrent that said, "Why can't you just comply and end this? Don't make this difficult." But Eliza couldn't back down. Not this time. Not again. Her refusal to move, her insistence that her space was just as valid as the white man's behind her, felt like a disruption. It was a quiet revolution. But it was still a revolution. The other passengers were beginning to notice, to see the truth in what was happening here. There was a man, standing there with the look of entitlement plastered across his face, expecting to have something Eliza had rightfully earned. And then there was her black, successful, dignified, and unwilling to move. One of the passengers, a middle-aged white woman sitting across the aisle, leaned forward slightly. "She's right," the woman murmured, almost too quietly, but just loud enough for Eliza to hear. "This doesn't seem right." Eliza caught her eye and nodded, grateful for the support, but it was fleeting. Most of the passengers were silent, uncomfortable in a way that felt familiar, like they knew something was wrong but didn't want to get involved. They knew they would rather let the conflict settle itself, hoping that Eliza would back down and make their lives easier. Another voice, a man from a few rows back, chimed in, his tone flat, indifferent. "It's just a seat. Move on already." Eliza's fingers tightened around the armrests, the weight of their gazes, the murmurs of irritation. They weren't directed at the flight attendant or at the man in the suit. They were directed at her, as if her refusal to comply was an inconvenience to them, a disruption to the comfortable rhythm they had come to expect in their lives. But Eliza had long known that her very presence in spaces like this, spaces where success, privilege, and luxury often excluded people like her, was a disruption. Whether they wanted to acknowledge it or not, she had earned that seat, and she would not let anyone take it from her. Not today. Her defiance wasn't loud. It wasn't even dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and filled with a resolve that made every other person in that plane cabin feel the weight of her truth. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about a lifetime of being told, in ways big and small, that you don't belong in the spaces you fought for. The attendant, now visibly frustrated, stepped away, promising to return with a supervisor. Eliza remained in her seat, the tension in the air heavy but resolute. She was ready for the fight ahead, because she knew, deep down, this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Every black traveler who had ever been made to feel less than in spaces they had earned. And in this moment, Eliza understood something important. There was no turning back now. Eliza sat, unflinching, in her seat. The plane's engines hummed steadily, as though the world around her was untouched. As though she had not just become a part of a quiet, yet explosive confrontation. A few rows ahead, a young woman with an expression of discomfort glanced over her shoulder. And Eliza saw the hesitation in her eyes. There was a moment, fleeting but clear, when the young woman seemed to consider speaking up. Her lips parted, her gaze flickering between the two figures at the center of the storm. But, in the end, her lips pressed together, and her gaze moved away, back to her magazine. It was a subtle thing, but it wasn't lost on Eliza. The fear of being caught up in a fight, the unwillingness to risk discomfort. It was the kind of thing she had seen time and time again. And it wasn't just happening now. No, this wasn't a singular event. This was a system, a culture, an unspoken rule that people, particularly white people, were more comfortable in a world where things were quiet, where the status quo remained unchallenged. Her refusal to move wasn't just uncomfortable for the attendants or the man in the suit. It was uncomfortable for everyone around her. The attendant returned after a few minutes. This time not alone. A supervisor, a man perhaps 10 years her senior, followed her, his presence carrying a weight that was unmistakable. He was tall, wearing a suit that matched his authoritarian air. His steps were measured, controlled, as if he were walking toward an inconveniently unruly child who had disrupted a well-organized household. He approached Eliza with a smile that was meant to be placating, but was as insincere as the air in the cabin. "Ma'am, we understand there's been a misunderstanding," the supervisor began, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "We need to resolve this situation amicably." The words were harmless, polite even, but Eliza could feel the undercurrent beneath them, the implicit suggestion that this was somehow her fault, that she was the one causing the disturbance. In that moment, the supervisor's smile felt like a judgment. "I don't believe there's been any misunderstanding," Eliza replied calmly, but firmly. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't look away from him. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." There it was again, the familiar weight of her blackness in a room that wasn't meant for her. A soft tension in the air that couldn't be explained away. A quiet acknowledgement that she was disrupting something unspoken. The world was built around certain expectations. And the simple act of a black woman insisting on occupying a space she had earned was always going to be seen as a challenge. The supervisor's eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of irritation passing over his face. "I understand your position," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "But the other passenger has expressed a need to sit here. There are priorities at play here." "Ma'am." The other passenger, the man in the suit, stood just behind the supervisor. His arms crossed tightly over his chest. Eliza didn't need to look at him to know that he was trying, in his own quiet way, to assert dominance. There was nothing urgent or medically necessary about his request. She could see it clearly in the self-satisfied set of his shoulders and the smug smile creeping onto his face. He had expected to be obeyed. He had expected Eliza to fold, to recognize the unspoken hierarchy that governed spaces like this, to quietly concede. Eliza didn't break his gaze. "His priorities don't trump mine," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "I paid for this seat." For a moment, the supervisor seemed taken aback. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. A black woman in her seat asserting her right to remain there was not part of the expected narrative. He cleared his throat, his face shifting from one of rehearsed politeness to one of strained patience. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we really need you to cooperate. This is simply a matter of convenience." "Convenience?" Eliza repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Convenience doesn't justify asking someone to give up what they paid for. If this was truly a matter of necessity, then I would understand, but it's not. This is about comfort is comfort. At my expense." She could see the flight attendants shift uncomfortably. But neither of them spoke up. There was something about her calm resistance. Something about the way she refused to shrink. That made them uneasy. Eliza had done everything right. She had paid. She had been polite. And yet she was still being asked to move. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about her very presence. About her insistence on occupying space that others thought should be reserved for them. "I'm not moving," Eliza said again, her tone unyielding. The words were simple, but they held a weight that reverberated through the cabin. It was an act of defiance. Yes, but more importantly, it was an act of truth. And that was when the first cracks began to show. The murmurs spread, slow at first, like the faint rustling of wind through dry leaves. "She's right," someone said from the back of the cabin. "This isn't fair." The voice was quiet, but Eliza caught the words and felt a small surge of solidarity. Other passengers began to stir, their eyes darting between Eliza and the flight crew. Some leaned forward, their faces showing the strain of watching an interaction they weren't prepared to confront. Others pulled back, uncomfortable with the increasing tension. There was a growing sense of something shifting in the air, something fragile and unspoken. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about how Eliza, as a black woman, had become the unwelcome interruption in a space that wasn't made for her. It was about how, for years, she had been conditioned to feel like she didn't belong in these spaces. As though she was an outsider. And it was about how now, for the first time in her life, she wasn't backing down. The struggle for dignity had begun. The supervisor glanced at the flight attendant, then back at Eliza, his expression a mixture of frustration and confusion. He wasn't accustomed to this kind of resistance. His body language shifted, an attempt to regain control, to return to the smooth, predictable rhythm of air travel. "We may need to involve security," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of threat and exasperation. Eliza's heart quickened, but she did not flinch. The mention of security wasn't an unexpected twist, it was a familiar card played in situations like this, where a black person's insistence on their rights was treated as a threat. She knew what was at play here. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about a system that had been built on certain rules, the unspoken code that her presence in spaces like this could be tolerated. But only as long as she remained quiet. Invisible. "I'd like to speak with them myself," Eliza said, her voice low but firm. "I want it on record that I'm being asked to relinquish a seat I paid for without any legitimate reason." The supervisor looked stunned, caught off guard by her calm resolve. "There's no need to escalate this further," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "We're just trying to accommodate everyone." "No," Eliza replied, her voice gaining strength. "You're trying to accommodate him at my expense." There it was, laid bare, the uncomfortable truth. The issue wasn't that there wasn't enough space on the plane. The issue wasn't about priorities or convenience. It was about who got to take up space, who got to be seen, and who was expected to move when their presence was considered an inconvenience. The flight attendant's eyes flicked nervously around the cabin, sensing that the tension had reached a boiling point. People were watching, now really watching. The discomfort was thick in the air, like a storm cloud ready to burst. But Eliza didn't move. She couldn't. This wasn't just her fight, it was the fight of everyone who had been told, quietly and clearly, that they didn't belong. And so, the battle continued, slowly but relentlessly. With every word, every glance, every moment of resistance, a small ripple in the fabric of a system that had long been set against her. The story was just beginning to unfold. And though the challenges would grow more intense, so too would her resolve. Eliza's gaze never wavered, locked in a silent battle of wills. The supervisor, visibly uncomfortable, stepped back as the attendant made another attempt to calm the situation. But there was no mistaking the growing unease in the air. This wasn't the smooth, transactional interaction they had hoped for. No, this had become something else entirely, a confrontation that forced all those in the cabin, whether they wanted to or not, to reckon with something far older than a mere seat dispute. The attendant's polite smile had turned brittle, the kind of smile that comes from deep discomfort. She looked to her supervisor for direction, and he, despite his clipped, authoritative tone, seemed almost desperate for a way out. His earlier attempts at politeness had failed, and now, as the air grew thick with tension, he was reaching for whatever authority he could cling to. "We're going to have to involve security," he said, his voice colder now, tinged with the unease of someone who had long been comfortable enforcing invisible rules, but now found himself unsure of how to proceed. "If you refuse to move, we'll have to escalate this." Eliza's heart skipped a beat, but she held her ground, refusing to let the challenge break her calm. Security. She knew what that meant. It meant that her very presence had become something that needed to be controlled, that needed to be justified. She was a threat now. A woman of color insisting on her right to exist in the spaces that others, particularly white passengers, took for granted. "I'd like to speak to them," Eliza said, her voice low but carrying a steady conviction. Her words cut through the tension like a blade. "Please have them come. I want everything on record." Her calm, unflinching stance had become something larger now. This was no longer about one seat. This was about every instance in her life when the world had forced her to bend, to shrink, to make herself small so others could breathe more easily. It was about every job interview where she was asked to smile more, every meeting where she had to fight harder to be heard, every store where she had been followed because someone believed her skin made her suspicious. The flight attendant hesitated, casting a quick glance at the supervisor. They were no longer in charge of this moment. The passenger, the woman in the seat, had taken the reins of the situation. And there was something inherently unsettling about it. Not only had Eliza refused to move, but now, she had forced the powers that be to recognize her agency, her right to exist with dignity. The attendant, clearly uncomfortable, walked away without another word, moving toward the front of the plane. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Eliza could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their discomfort thick in the air like smoke. Some were avoiding her gaze, their faces etched with uncertainty. Others were watching with open curiosity, unsure of what was unfolding but sensing that it was important. Then there were those who, in the silent language of their gaze, told her the truth. They weren't angry at the airline. They weren't angry at the man in the suit. They were angry at her. Her refusal to comply had upset the natural order of things, and they couldn't quite bear it. It wasn't that they thought she didn't have the right to that seat. No, that would be too obvious, too crude, but there was something about a black woman standing firm that threatened something deeper. Something ingrained in the fabric of the world they knew. It made them uncomfortable, even if they couldn't articulate why. A murmur started to ripple through the cabin. Some passengers began to quietly exchange glances, their heads turning to assess the growing drama. A voice, soft but firm, spoke up from the back of the plane. "She's right. You know," the voice said, addressing the flight crew. "This isn't fair." Eliza caught the words, felt the solidarity, but it wasn't enough. Her fight was bigger than this moment. It was bigger than the seat. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for every black person who had ever been made to feel like they were an inconvenience. like their mere presence required explanation. Every black person who had ever been told that they weren't allowed to take up space, whether physically or in the world. The supervisor returned a few moments later, accompanied by a second staff member this time, a man in a suit who looked every bit the part of corporate authority. His expression was cold, clinical, as if he had been trained for this very type of encounter. He didn't even look at Eliza. Instead, he addressed the supervisor, his voice matter of fact, as though Eliza was a problem to be solved, a mere inconvenience in their smoothly running system. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his tone barely a whisper, as though he feared Eliza might overhear him. The supervisor explained the situation in clipped words, leaving out any mention of the real issue, the uncomfortable fact that a black woman was refusing to cede her place to a white man who felt entitled to it. The second man's eyes finally flickered over to Eliza, sizing her up in a single glance. He took in the sharpness of her suit, the confidence in her posture, the calm resolve in her gaze. And in that glance, Eliza felt it again, that quiet, insidious judgment, that feeling that, despite her accomplishments, her place in that seat, in that space, was never quite as certain as his. "This is a simple matter of policy," the corporate man said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We need to ensure the comfort of all passengers." "Comfort," Eliza repeated, her voice rising just enough to carry over to him. "Is that what this is about? Comfort at the expense of dignity? Of fairness? I paid for this seat. Why am I being asked to move?" The man faltered, momentarily caught off guard by her directness. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. Behind him, the supervisor shifted uncomfortably. The quiet buzz of whispers from the passengers continued to grow, the tension spreading like wildfire. "Eliza, you should just move," a voice from the back of the plane called out, its tone a mixture of frustration and impatience. Eliza turned slowly to face the man who had spoken. His face was tense, and his gaze was not on the flight attendants or the man in the suit, but squarely on her. "You're holding up the flight," he muttered. "Just move on." Eliza's breath caught, her grip tightening on the armrests. This man, like so many before him, didn't see her as a person. He didn't see her fight for dignity. He only saw an inconvenience, a disruption, a black woman, unreasonably standing her ground, and in doing so, challenging the unspoken rules that governed the comfort of people like him. It was easier for him to ignore the injustice and focus on the delay it caused him. "Why is it always up to us to back down?" Eliza said, her voice rising. "Why do we have to shrink? Make ourselves small to make others comfortable?" The room fell silent, the words hung in the air, and even the man in the suit seemed momentarily stunned. Eliza's gaze swept the cabin, and in that moment, she saw it, the discomfort of everyone around her, the unspoken truth of her resistance. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the quiet ways in which people like her were expected to remain silent, to bend to the will of others, to let go of their rightful place in the world simply because of who they were. And then, just as the silence began to settle, the door to the cockpit opened, and the captain appeared, his expression unreadable. The flight attendant, the supervisor, and the corporate man all turned toward him, a mix of hope and dread in their eyes. Eliza knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The captain's appearance did nothing to diffuse the tension, in fact, it seemed to heighten it. His crisp uniform, gleaming gold epaulettes, and air of authority all brought a certain finality to the situation, as if he were the last bastion between order and chaos. But Eliza wasn't about to shrink. Not now. Not when the moment had escalated beyond the confines of the plane's cabin. She held his gaze as he stepped closer, his eyes quickly scanning the situation, her seated with dignity, and the flight attendants flanking the man in the business suit. The supervisor stood awkwardly behind them, as if he were uncertain of his role in this particular drama. The tension was palpable, the weight of every second stretching longer, as if the cabin itself had become a stage where Eliza's refusal to move was the most significant act. "Ma'am," the captain said, his voice carrying an air of authority that was as polished as his uniform. He addressed Eliza, but it was clear that his presence was intended to placate everyone. "We've had a small issue with the seating arrangements, but I'm sure we can resolve this quickly." Eliza stared at him, noting the coolness of his demeanor, as though this were just another disturbance to be handled, another inconvenience to be smoothed over. She could feel the undertones of his words. The assumption that his authority, simply by virtue of his position, should be enough to solve the problem. But Eliza wasn't just a passenger. She was not just a body occupying space. She was a woman who had spent her life battling for that space. Who had fought to carve out a place in a world that constantly told her that her right to exist, to thrive, was negotiable. She could see it in the way the captain stood, unflinching. His eyes flickered briefly to the man in the business suit, whose posture was even more rigid now, as if the captain's arrival had confirmed his entitlement, and then to the supervisor, whose face had become a study in discomfort. Eliza could almost hear their collective thought. Get her to move. Fix this. End the disruption. Her voice broke the silence, calm and steady, yet fierce with the weight of all that had led to this moment. I'm not moving, Eliza said again, her words clear and firm. I've paid for this seat. I'm not asking for anything that isn't mine. I'm only asking that you respect my right to be here. The captain looked at her as though he had never quite encountered a woman like this before. His gaze flicked between her face and the other passengers, who, though largely silent, were no longer entirely indifferent to the situation. Some were leaning forward, watching with open curiosity. Others appeared restless, as though the disruption was not just an inconvenience to them, but an unwanted reality they weren't prepared to face. A reality where the old, comfortable patterns of authority, of privilege, and of race, were no longer as easily enforced. The captain hesitated. Ma'am, there's no need for this to escalate. I understand your position, but this is a matter of convenience. The other passenger's connection is tight. We're just trying to resolve the seating issue. Eliza narrowed her eyes. Convenience. She could feel the word like a slap, like a reminder that her rights were secondary to the ease of someone else's journey. His words were polite, but there was an undertone and assumption that it was her who had caused the inconvenience. It was always her who was the problem. Convenience for whom? She asked, her voice quiet but carrying an edge of steel. For him? The man who has been hovering over my seat since I sat down. Expecting to take something from me that I've paid for? The captain stiffened, caught off guard by the shift in tone. There was a moment of tension, as if he was recalibrating. He glanced at the business suit again. Ma'am, we are simply trying to ensure a smooth and timely departure, he said, his voice now tinged with impatience. But Eliza wasn't backing down. The more he spoke, the more she could feel the undercurrent of what he wasn't saying, the same quiet dismissal she had encountered throughout her life. The idea that she, as a black woman, was an interloper, a second-class citizen whose existence had to be justified, whose space had to be earned. She could see the discomfort spread like wildfire among the passengers. Some glanced at each other nervously, afraid of being drawn into something they didn't want to confront. Others watched with interest, some even leaning forward, silently urging her to hold her ground. But there were also those who made their opinions known with subtle glances, their faces pinched with frustration. To them, this was a disruption, a problem that needed to be solved. The tension in the air thickened. It was no longer just a seat dispute. It was an existential confrontation, one that forced the people in that cabin to reflect on the assumptions they had been carrying with them their entire lives. Eliza was challenging something they didn't want to confront. She was challenging the quiet, insidious racism that infected everyday life, the kind that was unspoken, often invisible, but deeply embedded in the fabric of this society. The kind that told black people that they could not expect the same comfort, the same rights, the same dignity as others. Let's be clear, Eliza said, her voice now a low rumble. This isn't just about a seat. It's about the space I'm allowed to take up in this world. It's about whether I get to exist fully in this space, or if I'm always going to be expected to move over, to shrink, to make someone else more comfortable because it's convenient for them. That's the problem here, and it's a problem that has been going on for too long. Her words were like a light cutting through the darkness. She could see the other passengers shift, could see their faces change as they realized what was happening, as they saw the deeper truth behind this exchange. But there were still those who, despite the clarity of her words, could not bring themselves to fully understand. Ma'am, the captain said, his voice thick with hesitation. We'll need to move forward with a resolution. Eliza stood up, slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving the captain's. She was no longer just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every black person who had ever been told to make themselves small to accommodate someone else's comfort. For everyone who had been told, without words, that their right to exist fully was negotiable. "I'm not moving," she repeated, her voice now steady, not angry, but filled with a quiet, determined power. "Not unless I hear a legitimate reason. Not unless I'm treated with the same respect as anyone else on this plane." There it was, the crux of the matter. Not a seat, not a convenience, but a simple, fundamental truth. Respect. The right to occupy space without question. Without apology. The flight attendant, the supervisor, and even the captain stood in silence for a moment. There was nothing more to say. The power had shifted. And Eliza knew this wasn't just about today. This was about a long history of silent battles fought by people like her. The battles that were small in the eyes of some, but mighty in the legacy they left behind. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And for the first time, it felt like the world this moment. This plane was listening. The silence stretched across the cabin, suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. Every eye in the plane was fixed on Eliza now. Even those passengers who had remained neutral in the beginning. It wasn't just the scene that captured their attention, it was the quiet strength radiating from the woman who refused to move. It was as though the very act of standing her ground had pulled back a curtain, exposing a truth everyone knew but few were willing to confront. The captain shifted uneasily, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. This was no longer just a matter of seat assignments or convenience, it had become a flashpoint. A test of authority and, more critically, a challenge to the unspoken racial hierarchy that governed society. The captain had been trained to deal with rowdy passengers, to calm disturbances, to restore order. But this was different. Eliza wasn't fighting over a drink cart or a reclined chair, she was challenging the fundamental structure of power. "Ma'am," the captain began, his voice tighter now, "I understand that you're upset. But I'm asking you to cooperate. This situation doesn't have to escalate." Eliza's eyes never left his. "I'm not upset," she said coolly. "I'm asserting my right to be here. That's all, and I'm not going to move." The captain's jaw clenched, the smile that had been so practiced earlier now gone. The flight attendant, who had been standing off to the side, glanced nervously between them, unsure how to proceed. The supervisor stood back, arms folded, looking at the floor as though this was a problem he could no longer ignore. But none of them truly understood what was at stake, not just here on this plane, but in the world beyond. Eliza felt it then, the full weight of her position. It wasn't just her seat that was in question, it was her right to exist fully and unapologetically. She had been asked, so many times in her life, to make herself small, shrinking in the face of every small injustice, every subtle exclusion, but not this time, not today. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some sympathetic, others calculating the costs of this disruption. A woman in her early 70s, seated a few rows behind Eliza, was watching closely. Her face was hard to read, but there was something about the way she held her breath, the slight furrow in her brow, that told Eliza this wasn't just a small inconvenience to her. This was something personal. "What's going on?" the older woman asked, her voice shaky but direct. Why can't she just sit where she paid to sit? It was a simple question, but it carried the power of 1,000 unspoken truths. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably, caught in the ripple of this moment. For many of them, this was just an ordinary flight, part of the rhythm of their daily lives. But Eliza's refusal had disrupted that rhythm. It had forced them to reckon with something much deeper than a seat dispute. It had made them confront the system of privilege, of race, that governed their world. The man in the business suit, whose entitlement had set this whole chain of events into motion, finally spoke up. His voice was low, but the edge of frustration was unmistakable. "This is ridiculous," he said, his eyes narrowing at Eliza. "It's just a seat. Why are you making this so hard?" Eliza turned to face him, her eyes steady and unyielding. "If it's just a seat, then why can't you sit in your own?" she replied, her voice soft but filled with a quiet power. "Why is my right to occupy this space suddenly negotiable, when yours is assumed?" The words stung, and for the first time, Eliza saw something flicker in the man's eyes. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, as though the weight of her question had caught him off guard. It wasn't just a matter of a seat, it was about the invisible systems of power that had allowed him to assume that a black woman's claim to the same space could be so easily dismissed. The cabin was still, the tension thick in the air. Eliza had drawn a line in the sand. And now everyone could see it, feel it. There were no easy answers to the questions she had posed. No simple fixes. No quick resolutions. The issue of race and privilege wasn't something that could be swept aside with a shrug and a smile. The flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, stepped forward, her hands wringing nervously. "Ma'am," she said, her voice more hesitant now. "I don't think this is going anywhere. I'm going to have to call security." Eliza's eyes flicked toward the attendant, but her gaze was not soft. "Call them," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Call security. Because I want it on record that you're asking me to move from a seat I paid for." Without any legitimate reason, the attendant faltered, her lips parting as though she hadn't expected this level of defiance. Her gaze shifted toward the supervisor, who gave her a small nod, though it was clear he was still unsure how to proceed. The captain, now fully aware of the stakes, stepped aside, retreating back to the front of the plane, his authority crumbling in the face of Eliza's calm resistance. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Eliza remained seated, unyielding. The other passengers, too, seemed caught in a collective moment of reckoning. Some of them had no doubt seen the subtle racism that pervaded daily life, seen it, but ignored it, because it was more comfortable to pretend it wasn't there. But now, they could no longer look away. Eliza was forcing them to confront the ugly, invisible truth that had governed their lives, one quiet injustice at a time. Finally, the security officers arrived, 2 men, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter and stockier, stood at the entrance to the cabin. They exchanged a glance before stepping toward Eliza. The taller officer, his face a study of professionalism, spoke first. "Ma'am, we've been asked to have you move from your seat." Eliza looked at them, her resolve unshaken. "And I've told them I'm not moving," she said, her voice even. "I've paid for this seat. If there's any legitimate reason for me to move, I'd like to hear it." The shorter officer stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. "We don't have time for this," he said, his tone harsher now. "The man has a tight connection, and this whole thing is holding us up. Do you really believe his schedule is more important than my right to sit in the seat I paid for?" Eliza's words cut through the tension like a blade. "Do you honestly believe that his time is worth more than mine? Simply because of the color of my skin?" The officers glanced at each other, clearly uneasy. They had expected someone who would shrink, who would back down under pressure. But Eliza was not that person. One of the passengers, a man near the front, stood up, his voice rising with the tension in the air. "Leave her alone," he said, his tone firm, yet uncertain. "She's right. You're treating her like she doesn't belong." The words were simple, but they hung in the air like an accusation. The officers glanced around, seeing for the first time that the entire cabin was watching. This wasn't just Eliza's fight anymore. It had become something larger, something that demanded attention. The officers hesitated, their faces betraying their confusion. They had come to remove a troublesome passenger. But instead, they found themselves caught in a moral dilemma. The system they had been trained to uphold, one that always assumed the black woman would comply, had been turned on its head. They had never expected this. And that was the point. Eliza realized, this moment wasn't just about a seat. It was about dismantling the everyday racism that people like her encountered without question. It was about saying, "I am here, and I am not moving unless you can show me why I should." The silence in the cabin was deafening. The truth was inescapable. The plane was silent again. But this time, it wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the quiet that came with realization, the weight of the situation settling heavily in the minds of those who had been witnesses. The unspoken truth rising like steam from a pot, ready to spill over. Eliza had spoken, and in doing so, had cracked open something deeper than the surface dispute over a seat. She wasn't just demanding a place on a plane, she was demanding her rightful place in the world. Her right to occupy space without apology. And that, Eliza knew, was the root of the tension. She wasn't just challenging the airline's policy or the entitlement of a white man in a business suit. She was challenging the entire framework of power that had built itself on her silence, on her compliance, on her willingness to shrink. The security officers, after their brief hesitation, had stepped back, seemingly caught between their training and their instincts. They had come to the plane prepared to enforce the rules, to remove the obstacle to a timely departure. But Eliza wasn't an obstacle. She was the truth, the uncomfortable truth that had been denied for so long. As the silence stretched on, The older woman seated behind Eliza, whose face had shown the first signs of sympathy, spoke up again. Her voice was steady now, but there was a tremor of something unspoken. Something raw. "This isn't right," she said, her voice cutting through the thick tension. "You can't just ask someone to move because someone else has more important plans. If she paid for that seat, she should have it." Eliza turned, grateful for the older woman's support. Though she had never expected anyone to speak up for her, she had learned long ago that the majority of people would rather stay out of it. Keep their heads down, and avoid making waves. It was easier that way. But not today. Not in this moment. The younger woman, who had been quiet until now, shifted in her seat, catching Eliza's eye. There was a hesitant flicker of recognition in her gaze, like she was suddenly waking up to the reality of the world around her. She looked around at the others. Some passengers were nodding, some watching with a mixture of anger and unease. But all of them were aware now. They were witnessing something larger than themselves. They were part of a story that wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something fundamental. And still, the man in the business suit remained standing, a mix of entitlement and confusion etched into his face. He had expected this to be over. Had expected Eliza to fold under the weight of authority. To do what he had always seen people like her do: step aside. Make space. Make it easy. But Eliza wasn't going anywhere. The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point. The passengers who had stayed silent began to murmur. Some in support of Eliza. Some grumbling under their breath, irritated by the delay. It was all coming to a head. This quiet reckoning. The murmurs grew louder now. The discontent palpable, as though the discomfort of the moment was too much for anyone to ignore. The reality that was usually buried in the subtle gestures and covert systems of privilege had been brought to the surface. A few rows ahead, a man in his late 50s, a business traveler, leaned forward and spoke up. "She's right," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. "You can't treat her like this. You can't just push people around because it's more convenient for you." Eliza turned to him, meeting his gaze. There was no arrogance in his words. No smug superiority, just a recognition of the wrongness of the situation. In his voice, there was an undertone of guilt, as though his recognition of her right to be here came with an acknowledgement that, for years, he had accepted the world as it was. He had accepted the injustices, the small cruelties, because it was easier that way. But this moment was different. This moment was forcing them all to look at the world they had been complicit in. Eliza nodded once, not in gratitude, but in acknowledgement of the larger truth that was now unfolding. This wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't about one seat on a plane. It was about standing up to a world that had taught black people to shrink themselves, to apologize for their existence. And it was about the quiet complicity of everyone who had known, on some level, that this was happening but had done nothing to stop it. The captain, who had been lingering at the front of the cabin, his presence now a stark symbol of authority, cleared his throat and stepped forward once more. "Ma'am," he said, his voice not as firm now, more measured, like a man who had seen the fight leave his own hands. "We have to ask you to move. This situation is holding up the entire flight." "I'm not asking again." But Eliza wasn't intimidated. Her gaze never left his. "If you really need me to move," she said, her voice steady and without fear, "then tell me why. Tell me why my seat isn't mine. Why I'm being asked to step aside for someone who hasn't earned this spot. Who hasn't done the work that I have. You want me to move? Then show me why." The captain paused, his lips pressing into a thin line. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. Not so directly. Not so unapologetically. His gaze flicked to the man in the suit, who now looked uncomfortable, as though he had been caught in a web of his own privilege. Eliza wasn't the only one who had felt the heat of this moment. Everyone in that cabin, whether they realized it or not, had been complicit in allowing a system of inequality to perpetuate itself. And now, they were being forced to confront it. "I don't have an answer for you," the captain said quietly, more to himself than to Eliza. "I can't explain this, but I have a duty to get this plane in the air." "Duty?" Eliza repeated. "Your duty is to everyone aboard this plane. And that includes me. Your duty is to treat me with the same respect you would anyone else." There was no grand gesture. No dramatic speech, just the quiet force of her truth. The steady rhythm of her words that cut through the years of silence, of marginalization, of being made to feel that her space was not as valuable as theirs. The business suit man stepped back. His face flushed. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, as though the words no longer mattered. And in that moment, Eliza saw it, the subtle collapse of the system. His discomfort was an uncomfortable but necessary reflection of the discomfort that had been building for years. For generations, the truth, like an old wound, had been exposed, and no one was sure how to heal it. The flight attendants, who had remained silent, now exchanged glances. They had been the enforcers of a system they never questioned. But now, in the quiet aftermath of Eliza's resistance, they were left wondering what role they had played in this. And as the seconds dragged on, Eliza realized something even more profound. This wasn't just a victory for her. This was a crack in the wall, a crack that might just widen if enough people started pushing. If enough people started asking why things had to be this way. Her resistance was small, it was personal, but it was also an invitation. An invitation for everyone else to see what had been hidden for so long and to ask themselves, how many times have I remained silent? How many times have I let this happen? The plane finally began to move forward, the engines roaring to life. But the battle had already been won. The plane was airborne now. The initial tension still thick in the air, but the hum of the engines seemed to signal a temporary truce, a calm that held only because it had to. The unspoken truth, however, hadn't dissipated. It lingered in the corners of the cabin, between passengers, between the flight crew, and in the lingering discomfort of the man in the business suit. Eliza, still seated in the same spot she had fought for, could feel the weight of what had just happened, what had unfolded. It wasn't just about her victory in this small, isolated moment. She had forced something bigger to the surface, something that could no longer be ignored. For years, for generations, these kinds of battles had been fought silently on the streets, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in homes. The seat dispute was just a microcosm of a far deeper and more insidious issue. The refusal to acknowledge the humanity of black people in spaces they were forced to share with the world at large. She looked around, her eyes scanning the cabin. Some passengers had resumed their quiet conversations. Others had buried themselves in their books or screens. But no one seemed truly at ease. It was as though everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop, for the moment of discomfort to pass and for normalcy to return. But normalcy, Eliza knew, would never return. Not in the same way it had been. The man in the business suit, now seated a few rows ahead of her, had returned to his seat after a long stretch of uncomfortable silence. But he didn't seem to have the same assurance he had walked onto the plane with. Eliza could see it in the way he fidgeted with his tie. The way he glanced at his watch as though he were measuring the time. Waiting for an inevitable confrontation. He still didn't understand. He still thought his discomfort outweighed hers. He still thought he had the right to move her from her seat. As though her space was negotiable. Just because his priorities had been inconvenienced. It wasn't just the flight that had been delayed, something far deeper had been delayed. 2. The reality of the situation had been pushed to the surface. But no one seemed ready to fully confront it. They didn't know how to. And Eliza knew that the real battle wasn't won on this plane. The real battle would be fought long after the plane had landed. Long after the conversations had quieted. It would be fought in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed this moment. And perhaps more importantly, in the minds of those who had remained silent. She could still feel the quiet gaze of the older woman behind her. The one who had spoken out on her behalf. It had been a small act, but it had been enough to plant a seed of discomfort in those around her. The older woman, though, seemed to know something Eliza had known for years. Sometimes the smallest act of resistance could break through the hardest walls. It could start a conversation, even if the world wasn't ready for it. Eliza leaned back in her seat, the familiar tension of the situation still gripping her. But there was something else, a certain clarity. A quiet understanding that had settled into her bones. She had done what so many others before her had done. She had refused to yield. She had forced the world to reckon with itself. She had made the invisible visible. But in the back of her mind, Eliza knew that the hardest part of this journey was yet to come. The confrontation had been public. It had been loud in its silence. But now, the aftermath would be far quieter, more insidious. As the flight continued, the crew resumed their duties. Eliza noticed the subtle shift in their behavior. They avoided her gaze when they passed her seat. treating her as though she were a thing to be managed, a problem to be avoided, rather than a person who had every right to be there. She caught the eyes of one of the attendants, young, blonde, and clearly uncomfortable, who had been the one to ask her to move earlier. The attendant looked at her with the kind of quiet guilt Eliza had become all too familiar with. She wasn't angry, but she was unsure. She had been told to do a job, and she had done it. But now, in the face of Eliza's resistance, she understood the deeper cost of that compliance. Eliza wanted to confront her, to ask her, "Do you understand now? Do you understand why I had to stand my ground?" But she didn't. There was no need. The woman had seen, just as everyone else had. And the truth, for all its discomfort, would not leave them easily. It would follow them, ripple through their lives, as it had followed Eliza her whole life. As the plane began its descent, the finality of the situation began to settle in. The time for confrontation was over. And now Eliza was left with the consequences. But she knew that the consequences were not just hers to bear. They were the consequences of a society that had grown so accustomed to its own privileges, its own comforts, that it had convinced itself that the suffering of others was a necessary sacrifice. That it could ignore the quiet discomfort, the subtle degradation, that people like Eliza had been forced to endure. And now, it was impossible to ignore. The moment the plane touched down, Eliza's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, already knowing what she would see. The story was already going viral. Someone had taken a picture of the confrontation, a snapshot of her sitting in the seat, the attendant standing uncertainly nearby. The caption read, "Woman refuses to move from paid seat. Tensions rise as racial inequality exposed on a flight." Eliza felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, a mix of anger, exhaustion, and a strange, bittersweet sense of relief. The truth was out there now. It had been captured in real time, for the whole world to see. And though the battle on the plane had been small, it had ignited something much larger. Her inbox was flooded with messages of support. Some of them were from people she knew, friends, colleagues, even strangers who had witnessed the moment through the photos and videos circulating online. Others were from people who had shared their own stories of discrimination, of being made to feel invisible, of being made to feel that their rights were negotiable. But even in the face of all this support, Eliza knew the work was only beginning. She had opened a door, and now, the world had to walk through it. The challenge, the real challenge, would be in how this moment was remembered, and more importantly, in how people responded. Would they see this moment for what it was? Or would they continue to bury it under layers of politeness, of appeasement, of pretending that everything was fine as long as no one was looking too closely? For now, Eliza walked off the plane, her shoulders back, her head high. She knew this battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The airport was bustling with the usual noise, the murmur of crowds, the whir of luggage carts, the soft announcements from overhead, but Eliza felt a strange stillness as she walked through the terminal. The roar of the engines had faded, but the echo of the confrontation was still there, reverberating in her chest. The reality of what she had done, of what had unfolded, was still sinking in. She had stood her ground. She had challenged the system in that small, enclosed space, and she had won. But now, the world was watching, and she knew the consequences of this victory would follow her far beyond the confines of the plane. Her phone buzzed again, and Eliza pulled it from her pocket. It wasn't a surprise to see her social media notifications flooded with messages. The story had gone viral. The photos of the confrontation, the images of her calm resistance, had spread across platforms, shared by people from all walks of life, people who recognized the deeper truth behind her refusal. But there was a weight to this viral attention that she hadn't fully anticipated. The first few messages were filled with praise, support from friends, strangers, even a few public figures who had heard her story. But as she scrolled further, the comments began to change. It wasn't just admiration she was receiving now, it was something more insidious. The trolls had arrived. One comment read, "Why do you always have to make everything about race? It's just a seat. Get over it." Another, "Typical. This woman probably just wants attention." And then, "If you can't handle the pressure, just stay home." She felt the sting of those words. But they were nothing new. She had encountered this kind of venom before, especially when the topic of race reared its head in uncomfortable places. People who had never had to fight for a seat, for a place at the table, felt threatened by the simple fact of her existence. Her very presence in that space demanding respect, demanding fairness was enough to expose the lies they had built their lives on. She clenched her jaw and put the phone back in her pocket. She couldn't afford to let those voices shake her. They wanted her to shrink. They wanted her to back down. But Eliza had learned long ago that this was the price of standing firm. There would always be people who would find her presence disruptive, find her refusal to bend intolerable. But for every hateful comment, there were 10 more supportive ones. For every person who tried to silence her, there were many more who understood that what had happened on that plane was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much deeper, more pervasive problem. Eliza had drawn the line. But it wasn't just her battle. It was everyone's. She had simply been the one to stand up first. As she walked through the terminal, she saw the faces of other passengers, some still caught in the aftershock of what had happened. Some pretending nothing had occurred. The man in the business suit had already disappeared into the crowd. But Eliza could still feel the residue of that moment hanging between them. He wasn't angry with her. She realized. He was confused. Deep down, he didn't understand how a woman like her could possibly challenge his world so openly, so unapologetically. He had been raised to believe that people like her were supposed to be invisible, pliable. His discomfort wasn't just about the seat, it was about the larger question of who had the right to take up space in a world that had been built on inequality. That was the core of the issue. That was the system she had been fighting. The system that had conditioned people to accept their place without question. It was the silent assumption that some people, by virtue of their skin, were never truly entitled to sit in the rooms where decisions were made, to live as fully as others did. And Eliza had forced that assumption into the open. The baggage claim area loomed ahead, and Eliza slowed her pace. She wasn't sure if she was ready to confront the real fallout of what had happened. The attention, the scrutiny, it was overwhelming. She could already imagine the conversations that would take place behind closed doors. There would be meetings at the airline's headquarters, internal reviews, training, the usual corporate reaction, but none of that would matter unless the people in those rooms took a long, hard look at what had actually happened, not just on the plane, but in every system of power they had inherited. She wasn't naive enough to believe that a single act of defiance would change the world. But she did believe that it could begin the process. One moment, one confrontation at a time. Because that was how change happened. Not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet, persistent refusal to accept what has always been. Her phone buzzed again, this time an email. She opened it to find a message from an old colleague. Someone who had been watching the unfolding story. The message was short, but it hid deep. I see you. I know this isn't easy. But you are sparking something. Eliza. Something big. Keep going. The words washed over her like a bomb. It was the reminder she needed. She wasn't alone in this. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But she wasn't fighting for herself alone. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Who had ever been made to feel less than. Who had ever had to wonder if the world was designed for everyone except them. As she grabbed her luggage, Eliza paused for a moment, looking around the crowded airport. The faces around her were a blur, some lost in their own worlds. Others watching with quiet judgment, but many more simply passing through, unaware of the wave that had just swept through their lives. She wondered how many of them, deep down, had known something wasn't right but hadn't been able to articulate it. Maybe now, after everything that had happened, they would see it more clearly. The escalator hummed in the background, people coming and going, but Eliza's path was clear. The challenge ahead would be a long one, stretching beyond airports and boardrooms. It would take a lifetime of pushing, of speaking up, of refusing to shrink. But she was ready, and she would keep fighting, not for accolades or recognition, but for the very right to exist as fully, as proudly, and as loudly as anyone else in this world, because her voice was her power and it would never be silenced again. As she walked out of the airport and into the world, Eliza understood that the true battle wasn't just about the moments of resistance, it was about the quiet, daily work of making sure the next generation would never have to ask for the space they deserved. The next generation would take it without apology, and the walls that separated people like her from their rightful place in this world would eventually